Meet the red-eyed wattle, Acacia cyclops. I am fascinated by this plant. Its red eyes grab my attention every time I see them in the bush. Not just because of the bright colour, but because they tell a story of a really clever survival strategy. G'day, I'm Karen. Thank you for joining me out in the bush to explore life in the bush. In this video we talk about Acacia cyclops, which I'm standing in front of here. By the end of this video you'll know its story as well. You'll learn some features to look for to help identify it in the bush. You'll understand the background behind its mythical name and why it's such a gem ecologically in its natural range, but unfortunately outside of its natural range can be very problematic. You'll also pick up a couple of revegetation tips too. So Acacia cyclops grows naturally in Western Australia from about Geraldton in the north through to Esperance in the south, and then continues through into South Australia along the coastal area, and it grows mostly in coastal areas. Where I'm filming today, I'm on Whadjuk Noongar Country, which is Whadjuk Noongar Country, and I'm north of Perth and I'm about 3 kilometres from the beach, so I'm right within its natural range. The plant's common names are Coastal Wattle or Red-Eyed Wattle. Acacia cyclops is the botanical name. Acacias are wattles. The name cyclops comes from what the seed looks like. If we come in close, you'll see inside the pod here we've got a black seed surrounded by a red and sometimes orange fleshy piece of material there called an aril that looks like an eye. So it's been named after the mythical giants with a single eye in their forehead, the cyclops. Does it look like an eye? A small one. Now this isn't just for show. This is what intrigues me about this plant because it's central to the species' survival. Before we dive into that though, let's look at a few features of Acacia cyclops so that you can identify it if you find yourself walking through the bush or the dunes. So what you want to look for are the leaves. Its leaves are between 40 to 90 millimetres long and about 6 to 12 mil wide. They're smooth, somewhat leathery, and they have a blunt apex end point with a little short point on the end. And then they also have these veins running the length of the leaf. There's about 3 to 5 prominent veins that you can see. Something interesting about acacias, a lot of acacias don't have true leaves. Acacias generally grow from the seed with these cute little fern-like leaves, but then they disregard those with some species. Some of them retain that leaf shape and others actually get rid of those, and the stem of the leaf flattens to become what's called a phyllodes, which performs the function of a leaf. So technically, botanically speaking, this is a phyllodes, but it doesn't matter if you call it a leaf because it serves the same function. But out of interest, it's a phyllodes. So the flowers of Acacia cyclops are these, what look like a little yellow fluffy ball, and they're a really typical flower of a wattle or acacia. They generally begin flowering about September and through to as late as May. However, you might even find the odd flower on the plant outside of that window. And on this plant you can see that there's flowers in all different stages, some that are not yet open, some that are open, some that are old. A range of insects pollinate these flowers, and then once pollinated they develop into this flattened broad seed pod. Now this might remind you of a pea. That's because they're in the pea family, and this is indicative of that. So the pods can get up to about 12 centimetres and have up to 15 seeds in them, and when they're ready they'll twist and open like this, and they display the seeds. So that's why they can catch your eye when you're walking through the bush, because you then see these beautiful bright red arils. And here's an example of an orange one. So they're not always red. And this is the feature I find fascinating, because what's of particular interest to me is the relationship between the seed and the animal vector that disperses the seed for it. A vector is just a name for an animal that disperses the seed. There can be different types of vectors, but I won't go into that. So the red is designed to attract birds. What the acacia is doing is actually offering up this fleshy, nutritious aril as a reward to the vector, who then disperses the seed, and preferably passes it through its gut and deposits it out the other end onto the ground, all nice and scarified, ready to grow. Now, scarified is a really cool word as well. When a seed like the acacia seed has passed through the gut of an animal, by the way, these have been found in emu poos as well. Had to get the word poo in there somewhere. They get the nutritious treat, that gets digested, the seed passes through, but in the process there's damage done to the outer coating of that seed, and that damage is basically a form of scarification, and then the seed is ready to grow. So I worked in a nursery many years ago, Southern Dandenong's community nursery in Victoria. I loved that job. Anyway, we couldn't just ask birds to eat the seed and poop them out. So we used different forms of scarification, like nicking the seed with a knife, or scratching it with a bit of sandpaper or a nail file. But that's something you can do if you're interested in growing native plants. A whole other video I need to dedicate to that. But that's what I mean by scarification. So it's naturally scarified by passing through the gut of an animal. And so that's how this plant cleverly rewards the vector, the bird in this instance, for transporting the seed to another location and preparing it to grow. Now, there's a couple of reasons why it's highly likely that these are mostly spread by birds. One is that the aril is red and that attracts birds. The other thing is that the seed is retained in the pod once the pod splits open, allowing the birds to see it. Now, if it had more of a yellowy, creamy coloured aril and exploded out of the pod onto the ground, then it would be more likely dispersed by ants. But that's not to say that these don't also get dispersed by ants. And I love the story behind this. Basically, they'll carry their seed with the aril because the aril's like attached on there. So they only want the aril, but they carry the seed and the aril together and they take that into their nest. Then they feed on the aril and the seed is left underground, effectively planted. But guess what? When a fire comes through the bush and that seed is neatly planted and protected, it's then the perfect opportunity after the next rains to grow and re-establish in the bush following that fire. I just love how nature works together like that, and that's why I love the story behind Acacia cyclops. Now, I did mention it's an ecological gem in its natural range. We've already talked about its seeds being a food source, but also flowers supply nectar and pollen for insects. Their bushy habitat provides roosting and nesting sites and shelter for birds and other small bush creatures, and they have a wonderful way of improving soil health. Being in the pea family, like I mentioned earlier with these pods, tells you it's in the pea family. A lot of peas, like and acacias particularly, are nitrogen fixers, which means they fix nitrogen to the soil, which improves the soil around them to assist other plants in the bush. They're what's called an establishment species or a pioneer species. Where there's been a bit of damage to the land, they'll be like the pioneers to come back up. They'll fix nitrogen to the soil and prepare the site for the next generation of plants. And hence, one of the reasons why they're great in revegetation. I mentioned I'd tell you a couple of revegetation tips. One being, include some acacias, but don't put too many in because they can be so successful. Have a look around the area that you want to revegetate and the bushland that's nearby to see what the natural density of acacias are and try to stick to that sort of density, because if you put too many in, they grow very quickly, and if you've planted other plants right next to the acacias, I've seen this happen, they just grow quickly, they shade out those other species, and those other species don't survive, so you've sort of wasted your time planting them. So put these spaced out, use them because they're great at fixing nitrogen. And on the dunes where you plant them in revegetation, it's great because they'll help stabilise the dune and prevent erosion. They'll grow that bushy habitat so quickly that there's early on in the restoration process, there's habitat for birds to hide in and roost and nest in. The plants behind them will be sheltered from the wind early on in the piece as well because they grow so quickly. So lots of benefits to planting these in revegetation. And another tip I want to let you know from years of experience of maintaining bushland in local government areas where there's pathways. If you've got a pathway going through the area that you're revegetating, please don't plant any too close to the edge because they're just going to grow over your pathway, and then you're going to have to spend time, money, pruning them back all the time. So just keep them back a bit from your pathways. A word of warning though, the reason why this is so great in revegetation within its natural range is also the reason why you should never plant it outside of its natural range, because all of its strategies that it uses to be so successful can cause it to become an invasive weed and outcompete other species that haven't evolved to coexist with Acacia cyclops. So a good reminder to plant local as much as possible, because you never know if you could be introducing a weed to an area. If you do live in an area where Acacia cyclops is in its natural range and you're interested in revegetation, or maybe you're a friend of a coast care group or friends group, this book by Kingsley Dixon is a wonderful resource to have. He talks about not just identifying the species, but how they can be used in restoration. So I do highly recommend that book. This is my copy and I've had it for years. There's actually a newer version out now that looks a bit nicer and has a little bit more updated information. I'll put a link in the description below so that you can purchase that book if you're interested. If you've enjoyed this video, give me a thumbs up. It helps people find the video. By all means, share the video with your friends if they like restoration or bushland plants and animals, anything Australian bushland. I hope you get some time in nature. I hope this video has inspired you to go out and look closer at plants and think about the stories behind their special features, because I find it fascinating and I hope you do too. Enjoy the rest of your day. I'll see you in my next video exploring life in the bush.